Pivot table reports are a powerful way to summarize, analyze, explore, and present your data in a report. Pivot tables can help you make sense of your data, especially when you have a lot of it. This table has 800 rows. Click any cell in your data. Click Insert, Recommended Pivot Tables. Excel recommends pivot table layouts that'll work well with your data. To help you decide, pick each of the recommendations to see what your data will look like in the preview box. Sum of order amount by salesperson is what I want, so I click OK. Excel creates the pivot table on a new worksheet. The pivot table fields list appears to the right. We'll cover that in the Create a Pivot Table Report Manually video. I'm going to zoom in a little to make the pivot table easier to read. Right-click any cell in the Sum of Order Amount column, click Number Format, pick Currency, and click OK. And the numbers in the column are formatted as currency. Up next, create a pivot table report manually. This table contains data about book sales. It has a column for the genre of the books, the date they were sold, the sales amount, and the store where they were sold. Before you create a pivot table, the data you're going to use, referred to as source data, should be arranged correctly. All the columns should have headings. The headings are used to name the fields in the pivot table. Each column contains the same type of data. For example, text in one column and currency in another. And there should be no blank rows or columns. For this pivot table, we'll use source data that's in a table. It doesn't have to be in a table. A range of cells can be used as well. For information about using external data, see the article Create a Pivot Table to Analyze External Data. For information about using multiple database tables, see Create a Pivot Table to Analyze Data in Multiple Tables. There's a link to both articles in the course summary at the end of the course. Click any cell in the data. Click Insert, Pivot Table. All of the source data is automatically selected. In this example, the entire source data table. We recommend using a table because, if the table grows, the pivot table will automatically include the new data when you refresh the pivot table. For information about creating a table, see the link Create or Delete an Excel Table in a Worksheet in the course summary. By default, the pivot table will be created on a new worksheet. If you want, you can create it on an existing worksheet instead by clicking Existing Worksheet and providing the location. Click OK. In our example, a new worksheet with an empty pivot table is created. In the pivot table fields list, at the top are the fields we'll use to create the pivot table. They're the same as the column headings in the source data. At the bottom are the 4 areas of a pivot table the fields can be added to: rows, columns, values, and filters. I check the genre field, and it's added to the pivot table as rows of text labels. By default, text fields are added as rows and numbers as values. Check the sales amount field, and it's added as a column of values that are added using the sum function. Right-click a cell in the Sum of Sales Amount column, click Number Format, and click Currency. I don't want any digits after the decimal place, so I set the decimal places to 0. Click OK, and we can see the total sales for the different genres of books. I click and drag the store field to columns, and we can see the sales of genres for each store along with grand totals. An important factor we don't have in the pivot table yet are dates. How do sales differ over time? I check the date field, and it's added to the rows area. But this many rows of dates makes the pivot table hard to use. Let's group the list of dates. Right-click any date and click Group. I'll use the default months, but you can select one or more options, such as quarters and years. Click OK. The dates are grouped under the genres by month, much easier to work with. And we can see the sales of the genres over time for each store. When you click any cell in a pivot table, the Pivot Table Fields list and the Pivot Table Tools tab appear. When you click outside of the table, they go away. Under Pivot Table Tools, click the Design tab to change how the pivot table looks. For example, click Report Layout, click Show an Outline Form, and now genre and date are in separate columns. Check banded rows to make it easier to read across the rows of the pivot table. Click the down arrow next to Pivot Table Styles. There are many options. When you mouse over them, you get a preview of what the pivot table will look like. Click the style you want to change the look of the pivot table. We'll cover the Analyze tab in subsequent videos. Up next, sort, filter, summarize, and calculate your pivot table data. You can analyze pivot table data in many ways. One of the most common ways is sorting. It helps you quickly see trends in your data. Right-click a value, such as the grand total for the arts and photography genre, point to Sort, click Sort Largest to Smallest, and the genres are sorted from the largest to smallest grand total sales amounts. On the Quick Access toolbar, click Undo to undo the sort. You can also filter your pivot table. It helps you focus on the data you want to analyze. Click the down arrow next to row labels. Since we clicked the down arrow for a label, point to Label Filters. Click an option, such as Begins With. Type your criteria, such as the letter C, and click OK. And only genres of books that start with C are displayed. To remove the filter, click the down arrow again. It now looks like a funnel because the filter's applied. And click Clear Filter from Genre. Slicers are one of the best ways to filter your pivot table data. For information about using slicers, see the 4th video in this course. Use slicers, timelines, and pivot charts to analyze your pivot table data. To view only the items in your pivot table that you want, you can select the cells that contain the items. These can be text or dates under row labels. You can't use numbers. Right-click them, genres in this example, point to Filter, click Keep Only Selected Items, and only the selected genres are displayed. To show only the 3 genres with the highest grand totals, right-click a genre, point to Filter, click Top 10. I know, clicking Top 10 to see the top 3 doesn't seem to make sense, but look. Change 10 to 3, click OK, and the top 3 genres are displayed. Until now, the values in the pivot table have been displayed as the sum of the sales amount field, but you can use other functions. For example, right-click a cell in the grand total column, point to Summarize Values By, there are a lot of options, such as min and max. Click an option, such as average, and now the values in the pivot table are summarized as averages. You can see that the average arts and photography sales is $1,400. In addition to summarizing the sales figures, you can show them as a calculation. For example, right-click a cell in the grand total column, point to Show Value As. There are a lot of options, such as percent of row total and percent of column total. Pick an option, such as percent of grand total, and you can see that arts and photography represents a little over 10% of sales, and how each store contributes to that figure. For more information about calculations in pivot tables, see the link in the course summary. Up next, use slicers, timelines, and pivot charts to analyze your pivot table data. There are a lot of advanced tools in Excel to help you analyze your pivot table data. You can use slicers and timelines to filter your pivot table data, and at a glance, you can see what filters are applied. To add a slicer, click a cell in your pivot table, and the Pivot Table Tools tab appears. Click Analyze, click Insert Slicer. The Insert Slicer dialog has options for each field in the pivot table. Check the fields you want to slice the pivot table with, and click OK. Adjust the size of the slicers, move them where you want, and you're ready to slice your pivot table. To see the cooking and romance books sold in October at the Bellevue and Seattle stores, in the genre slicer, click Cooking, press the Control key, and click Romance. In the date slicer, click October. In the store slicer, click Bellevue, press the Control key, and click Seattle. And in the pivot table, you now see just the cooking and romance books sold in October at the Bellevue and Seattle stores. To reset the slicers, click the Clear Filter button at the top right of each slicer. To add a timeline, click a cell in your pivot table. On the Analyze tab, click Insert Timeline. The Insert Timelines dialog has an option for each date field in your pivot table. In this example, there's just one. Check the field and click OK. Adjust the size of the timeline and move it where you want. In the upper right of the timeline, click the drop-down arrow and choose a time frame, such as days. Use the slider to move along the timeline. Select a day, click an end of the selector, and drag it to cover the time period you want. And the pivot table now displays the sales for the time period. You can use timelines and slicers together to filter your pivot table data. To reset the timeline, click the Clear Filter button at the top right of the timeline. Pivot charts provide a visual representation of your pivot table, making it easier to see trends. To create a pivot chart, click a cell in your pivot table. Click Analyze. Click Pivot Chart. In the Insert Chart dialog, click the chart type you want. And click OK. For information about different chart types, see the link in the course summary. Move the chart and make it the size you want. When you filter with the timeline and slicers, the chart automatically updates. Now you've got a pretty good idea about how to use pivot tables. Of course, there's always more to learn, so check out the course summary at the end, and best of all, explore Excel 2013 on your own.